It has not been lost on me, the irony that as soon as I try to get back in touch with my inner child here on the channel, circumstances should arise which cause me to resemble my inner child, now more so than ever. I will admit I don't really like it. It's itchy, it's uncomfortable. I don't like the way wind feels on my face. But don't feel too bad for me. There is a pretty good reason for this. I won't go into details, but to make a long story short, I am now $100 richer, and I was able to make a room full of high school students absolutely soil themselves with laughter. So my lack of beard isn't. I'm not taking it too hard. Uh, but I will say that you guys might have to put up with this hairless monstrosity for a while. Hopefully not too long. My facial hair tends to grow back pretty quickly. But until then, yeah, it's just gonna... Things are gonna be a little different around here on Secret Fire Books. But with that all out of the way, let's talk some Redwall. Hello there, fellow travelers. I'm Tim from Secret Fire Books. In my last video, I talked about how I wanted to get back into the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. These were really important books that I read as a kid, but I never finished them all. And so I wanted to make it my top reading goal of 2025 to collect and read all 22 of these books, and hopefully do reviews for each of them here on the channel. Now, something that I wanted to talk about in that video, but actually decided against in the last minute, was the topic of morality in the world of Redwall. And I could have touched on it briefly in that video, but I decided that it would be much interesting to make sort of a long-form video dedicated to just that subject. And hopefully it would provide for a pretty interesting discussion, because I think the topic of morality, as it pertains to the Redwall series, is really interesting. So basically, in the world of Redwall, morality is very, very black and white. And that very strict good and evil kind of morality basically pertains to two main factions in the world of Mossflower Forest. The two main factions are what I like to call the critters and the vermin. The critters are all the cute animals, the mice, the moles, the badgers, the otters, the squirrels. They're always the good guys. And then the vermin are always rats, weasels, foxes, stoats, ferrets. They're always the bad guys. And the thing is that in all 22 of these books, or at least the ones from the series that I have read, Brian Jacques almost never wavers from these two archetypical factions. The good guys, the critters, are always good, and the bad guys, the vermin, are always evil. And there are virtually no exceptions. And the thing is, when, if ever, the Redwall series gets brought up nowadays, people usually use this as the main form of criticism. It is the biggest complaint that people have about the series, and from what I've read online, it's actually turned off quite a few people to reading the series, which I find very unfortunate. The thing is, I don't really mind black and white morality. In fact, in fantasy at least, I actually prefer a more black and white approach to the sort of morally gray dreck that's really played out in modern fantasy nowadays. And my favorite book of all time is The Lord of the Rings, a book where there is a definite binary morality. All the good guys are good, all the bad guys are bad. But the way Brian Jacques handles morality in Redwall makes for some kind of problematic well, I should say problematic. That's not quite the right word. I guess I should say it makes for some kind of stale, predictable character writing. For example, if a character is a rat, that rat is always going to be evil. He's never going to see the error of his ways. He'll never see the light. He can never be redeemed. He will just always be a scummy, good-for-nothing, murdering, stealing, devious rat. But on the other end of the spectrum, if a character is a mouse or a squirrel, they will always be a stand-up guy. They'll always be the hero. They'll always do the right thing in the end. They'll never be morally morally compromised. They'll never turn to the dark side. And so even though Jakes can write some really fun characters in his stories, these characters aren't all that complex, and you never really have to worry about any kind of moral quandaries that these characters have to deal with. The only challenges they face are the immediate dangers that they're presented with on whatever quest they're going on. Now, I seem to remember in a Q&A, I think on his official website, Brian Jakes once touched on the sort of morality in the world of Redwall, and he mentioned that one of the reasons he does this with his characters is that he just prefers to do it that way. He likes his goodies good and his baddies bad, as he puts it. But one of the other reasons that he mentioned is that he doesn't want to make things too complicated for his readers. Again, these are middle grade fantasy books. These are directed at younger readers. And so Jakes felt that kids wouldn't appreciate or wouldn't enjoy evil characters who sometimes did good things, or good characters who sometimes messed up and did evil things. And I really don't agree with that, because as a kid, I understood complex morality when it came to character writing. One of my favorite movies as a kid, as I mentioned in my previous video, was Disney's Robin Hood. And it wasn't just the Disney version. I watched all the Robin Hood movies I could. I was a big fan of the sort of the mythos behind the Robin Hood character. But I was under no illusions as to what kind of a person Robin Hood was. Really think about Robin Hood for a second. What is his primary characteristic? That he's a thief. Now, unless you've grown up in some kind of bizarro world where society teaches you that stealing is totally okay morally, you have to admit that you need to accept that there's a certain gray area with Robin Hood. Now, usually in most versions, the character is stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. In most versions, he has some kind of altruistic motive when stealing, when committing crimes. In some versions, he doesn't, but in most versions, he does. But he's still stealing. He's still committing a crime. He's still doing something wrong in order to support a greater good. So there is a bit of gray area there. And that's something that always made Robin Hood really interesting to me as a kid.
You know something, Robin, I was just wondering. Are we good guys or bad guys? You know, I mean, are robbing the rich to feed the poor?
Rob? That's a naughty word. We never rob. We just sort of borrow a bit from those who can afford it.
Borrow? Boy, are we in debt.
Other characters like Han Solo from Star Wars. You can see the Star Wars poster behind me. I love the original Star Wars trilogy. Han Solo is a smuggler. His literal profession is shipping mass quantities of contraband from one end of the galaxy to another. But of course, as we learn at the end of the movie, he's a jerk with a heart of gold. He is a nice person, but he's rough around the edges. He lives a dangerous, illegal life, and that always made him very interesting to me. So I really don't agree with Jakes in that kids don't like or don't appreciate or don't understand complex, morally gray characters. Now, there are times in the Redwall series where Jakes kind of teases those lines between that black and white binary, but not really. The first example I can think of is in the original Redwall, where we're introduced to a tribe of warrior sparrows who live in the rafters of the titular Redwall Abbey. And it's weird. Some animals Brian Jakes treats as having this kind of sapient level of intelligence, the critters and the vermin mainly. And others he just kind of treats like, I don't know how to put it. They're kind of like the animal version of Neanderthals. They have like this sub-sapient intelligence where they're kind of stupid. They can kind of communicate with other animals, but not really. And they're kind of barbaric. It's weird. But the sparrows in the original Redwall are sort of this neutral party. They don't support the villains or the heroes. They're kind of just in it for themselves. Although one of the sparrows, I think her name is Warbeak, I'm pretty sure that's the name of the character, she comes to become one of the main character, Matthias's, one of his allies. And that's really the only bit of moral blurring that I can remember from the original Redwall. Now later, Jakes would write this book, The Outcast of Redwall. I believe this is the either 7th or 8th book in the series. And the entire premise of this book is a ferret who is raised by the critters at Redwall Abbey. A ferret is notoriously one of the evil animals in the world of Redwall, but he's raised by the mice and squirrels and badgers at Redwall Abbey. And so you'd think that this would be a story about a really conflicted character, because at some point he does do something horrible and they cast him out of Redwall Abbey. He becomes a pariah. And you'd think that this would be a sort of redemption story for this character. And without giving too much of the story away, by the end of it, it's kind of nebulous as to whether this character could have been redeemed or not. I think Jakes meant for it to be that way, but reading it as a kid, it really seemed like this character was irredeemable. And it kind of feels like Jakes fell on the side of the nature side of the nature versus nurture argument. That if you're a creature who comes from bad stock, you're just bad through and through. You're gonna be a rotten, rotten animal. And then he does the opposite in a later book, The Tagarung, where we have another character, this time an otter, one of the good ones, who's raised by a group of weasels, these weasel bandits. And so once again, you have an opportunity for some really interesting character writing. We have a character who could potentially be very conflicted because he comes from a very peaceful society, but he's raised by a literal group of murdering bandits. But once again, Jakes kind of drops the ball, and this character, Tag, ends up being a real noble stand-up guy. There's really no confliction in his heart. And so, even as a kid, I remember getting to the end of this book and being kind of disappointed that there was no real moral quandary that this character had to make it through. The last thing that I can think of is in the story Rackety Tam. In the beginning of that book, the main character, Rackety Tam, is this squirrel of mercenary, which is an interesting profession for an animal to have. As far as I recall, I don't believe there's any kind of currency in Mossflower Forest. I don't think they have any kind of universally accepted trade system, but I guess maybe he's just selling his sword for food and shelter, I guess. But at the beginning of the story, he's actually in prison because it turns out that he insulted the people he was working for. He ruined some kind of ceremony that this king squirrel was holding in his court, and so he was sentenced to the dungeon. And so it's this kind of interesting beginning for this character, but as far as I remember, after he gets bailed out of prison eventually, he just becomes this stand-up hero who never has any kind of moral quandary as well. So there are so many times when Brian Jakes seems like he's teasing the moral boundaries, but he never really does. And you can definitely tell that he wanted to, there were times where he wanted to write some more complex narratives, but he always came back to the idea that, no, I'm writing this for the kids. And in his mind, kids don't care about gray morality, which again, I think is false, but it's just the way he did it. So I can definitely see why those aspects of the stories would be a turnoff for some people. I will say, if you're the kind of person who needs complex morality in your fantasy, if you need all of your characters to be very morally gray and really struggle with their inner demons and with the ethics of their situations, Redwall is definitely not for you. You can sleep on Redwall. But if you can look past that, if you can get around all that and realize that this is a series that was written by a very old-fashioned guy who just meant to give a young audience some good, clean, action-adventure fun, I think you'll really enjoy Redwall. I can't recommend this series enough. Even as a kid, when I complained with some of these story writing choices, I was still really enjoying myself. I know I complained about Tagarung, but as a kid, this was actually one of my favorite books from the series. I probably read this like 4 or 5 times. I loved it so much. But that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments, guys. What do you think of the Redwall series? If you have read it, what do you think of the way Jakes uses morality? If you haven't read it, tell me, is that sort of a turnoff to you? Can you give the series a chance, knowing that it doesn't have very deep, complex characters? But until next time, as always, farewell and keep reading.
chaps and chapesses! My name is Brian Jakes and I come from... England! From a city called... Liverpool! And who's got the best soccer team in the world? England! Get out, you swine.